The shallow waters of the King's Channel outside Copenhagen churned violently under the impact of heavy iron round shot. It was the second day of April in the year 1801, and the British Royal Navy was engaged in a ferocious struggle against the defensive fleet of Denmark. Thick gray smoke from hundreds of black powder cannons drifted across the freezing Baltic waves, obscuring the sun and choking the sailors on the decks. The roar of the broadsides was deafening, a constant thunder that shook the very timbers of the wooden warships. Splinters of oak flew through the air like deadly shrapnel, maiming men and tearing through rigging in a chaotic dance of destruction. This was not merely a skirmish over trade routes or territorial waters, but a desperate bid to dismantle a threat to the survival of Great Britain. The French Republic, led by the ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte, was expanding its influence across the European continent with terrifying speed. Britain stood as the last major power resisting French hegemony, but its strength relied entirely on its naval supremacy. That supremacy was now jeopardized by the League of Armed Neutrality, a coalition of northern powers including Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark. If these nations combined their fleets with the French Navy, the balance of power would shift, effectively strangling the British Isles into submission. At the center of this naval maelstrom stood Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, a man whose name was already whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear across Europe. He was a complex figure driven by a relentless hunger for glory and a patriotic fervor that bordered on obsession. Physically battered by years of service, Nelson had lost his right eye in Corsica and his right arm in Tenerife, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He possessed an intuitive grasp of naval tactics that often defied conventional wisdom. However, his aggressive nature often clashed with the more conservative instincts of his superiors, creating friction that would soon play a pivotal role in the unfolding battle. The question looming over the icy waters of the Baltic was whether Nelson could overcome the formidable Danish defenses before the British fleet was destroyed. The Danes had positioned their ships and floating batteries in a formidable line, anchored firmly to the seabed, making them stable platforms for accurate gunnery. To make matters worse, the British were operating in unfamiliar and treacherous shoals, where running aground meant certain disaster. With the cautious Admiral Sir Hyde Parker commanding the expedition from a distance and signaling for retreat, the outcome hung in a delicate balance. Would Nelson obey orders and withdraw, or would he gamble everything on a daring attack? The answer to that question would become one of the most famous moments in naval history and a defining instance of calculated insubordination. Nelson chose to ignore the recall signal, famously placing his telescope to his blind eye and claiming he could not see the order. He pressed the attack with ferocious intensity, turning a potential stalemate into a crushing victory. The immediate aftermath saw the shattering of the League of Armed Neutrality and a shift in the geopolitical landscape. This decision not only secured British naval dominance, but also cemented the legend of Nelson as a commander who played by his own rules. To understand how this dramatic climax was reached, we must look back to the political tensions that boiled over in the early months of 1801. The British government was alarmed by the formation of the League of Armed Neutrality, which claimed the right to trade freely with France despite the British blockade. The British viewed this as a direct act of hostility that undermined their war effort against Napoleon. Diplomatic efforts to dissolve the League had failed, leaving military force as the only remaining option. A massive fleet was assembled at Great Yarmouth, destined for the Baltic Sea to enforce British will through the barrel of a cannon. Command of this critical expedition was given to Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, a wealthy and aging officer who had recently married a woman 40 years his junior. Parker was seen by many as hesitant and overly cautious traits that were ill-suited for a mission requiring speed and decisiveness. Horatio Nelson was appointed as his second in command, a pairing that the Admiralty hoped would balance caution with aggression. From the outset, the relationship between the two men was strained. Nelson was eager to sail immediately, while Parker seemed content to delay, enjoying the comforts of shore life and planning balls rather than battles. The fleet finally departed in March, battling severe gales and biting cold as they crossed the North Sea toward the Kattegat. As they approached the Danish coast, the strategic dilemma became apparent. To reach Copenhagen, the fleet had to navigate the narrow sound between Denmark and Sweden, or take the longer route through the Great Belt. The sound was heavily defended by Kronborg Castle at Elsinore, a fortress bristling with heavy guns. Nelson argued passionately for a direct approach, wanting to strike before the Russians could join the Danish fleet. He wrote letters to Parker urging him to ignore the risks and focus on the destruction of the enemy. Upon anchoring near the entrance to the Sound, the British attempted one last diplomatic overture. Nicholas Vansittart, a diplomat accompanying the fleet, was sent to Copenhagen with an ultimatum. The Danish government, led effectively by Crown Prince Frederik, refused to back down. They were bound by treaty to their allies and were prepared to fight to defend their neutrality. Vansittart returned with news that the Danes were strengthening their defenses by the hour. This report only increased the anxiety of Admiral Parker, who began to worry about the strength of the fortifications and the potential arrival of the Russian fleet. A council of war was held aboard the flagship, where the atmosphere was thick with tension. Parker and his captains debated the best course of action, with many expressing grave concerns about the Danish strength. Nelson, pacing the cabin with nervous energy, dismissed the dangers of the Russian fleet, calling them a non-threat until the ice melted. He proposed a bold plan to take a squadron of lighter ships through the difficult King's Channel and attack the Danish line from the south, avoiding the heavy guns of the Treacherous fort at the northern end. It was a risky maneuver that required precise navigation. Parker, despite his reservations, recognized the genius in the plan and the determination in his subordinate. He granted Nelson 12 ships of the line, along with all the frigates and bomb vessels, to execute the attack. Parker would remain to the north with the heavier ships to cover the reserve and protect against any external interference. This division of forces was a gamble, but it gave Nelson the freedom he craved. The die was cast, and the British fleet began the difficult task of maneuvering into position amidst the shifting shoals and currents. The night before the battle was a sleepless one for Nelson and his captains. The waters of the King's Channel were notoriously difficult to navigate, and the Danes had removed all the marker buoys. Captain Thomas Hardy spent the darkness in a small boat sounding the depths of the channel, with a lead line often within earshot of the Danish sentries. His findings were crucial, allowing the British to map a tenuous path through the shallows. Nelson sat in his cabin writing final letters and organizing the order of battle, his mind focused entirely on the coming dawn. On the morning of April 2nd, the wind shifted to the south, a stroke of luck that allowed Nelson's squadron to sail parallel to the Danish line. The signal to weigh anchor was hoisted, and the British ships began to move their white sails, filling with the favorable breeze. However, the treacherous nature of the channel soon made itself known. The Agamemnon, one of Nelson's favorite ships, failed to weather the shoal and was forced to anchor out of range. The Bellona and the Russell also ran aground effectively, removing 3 powerful ships from the line of battle before a single shot was fired. Nelson, aboard his flagship, the Elephant, watched with frustration as his force was depleted. He quickly reorganized his line, hailing the captains of the remaining ships to close the gaps. The Danish defense consisted of a long line of 18 ships and floating batteries anchored along the coast, protected by the shoals. At the northern end stood the massive Treacherous fort, armed with 66 heavy cannons. The Danes manned their vessels with a mix of sailors, soldiers, and volunteers, all determined to protect their capital city from the invaders. At 10 in the morning, the first shots rang out, signaling the start of the general engagement. The British ships anchored by the stern opposite their Danish counterparts and unleashed a torrent of fire. The distance between the opposing lines was less than 2 cables' length, ensuring that every shot found a target. The Danish resistance was far fiercer than the British had anticipated. The floating batteries low in the water proved difficult to hit, while their crews returned fire with rapid and accurate broadsides that raked the British decks. The battle raged with unrelenting fury for hours. The noise was so intense that men had to shout into each other's ears to be heard. Smoke enveloped the combatants, creating a hellish landscape where only the flashes of cannon fire illuminated the gloom. Captain Edward Rieu, commanding the frigate squadron, boldly attacked the Treacherous fort, attempting to draw its fire away from the main line. His frigates, being much lighter than the ships of the line, suffered terribly under the heavy guns of the fortress, but Ryu held his station with immense courage. Miles away in the deep water to the north, Admiral Parker watched the battle through his telescope. The smoke and the constant roar of guns told him that the resistance was obstinate. He could see that the Bellona and Russell were flying distress signals, and he feared that Nelson was being overwhelmed. His cautious nature overtook him, and he reasoned that Nelson might be unable to retreat without orders. To save his subordinate from potential disgrace, Parker decided to hoist the signal number 39, which ordered the fleet to discontinue the action. On the quarterdeck of the Elephant, the signal lieutenant reported Parker's hoist to Nelson. The Vice Admiral continued to pace the deck, his stump of an arm twitching in agitation. He asked the lieutenant if his own signal for close action number 16 was still flying. When confirmed, Nelson ordered that it be kept flying. He then turned to his captain, Thomas Foley, and expressed his frustration. He knew that to retreat now through the narrow channel under fire would be suicidal for his damaged ships. The only way out was forward through victory. It was then that Nelson performed the act that would define his legacy. He raised his telescope to his blind right eye and peered toward Parker's ship. With a dry wit, he remarked to Foley that he really did not see the signal. This was not merely a joke, but a calculated rejection of authority based on his assessment of the tactical reality. By claiming blindness, he gave himself a plausible deniability while ensuring that the battle continued. He knew that the Danish fire was beginning to slacken, and that victory was within reach if they maintained the pressure. The other British captains saw both signals flying: Parker's order to retreat and Nelson's order to engage closer. They knew Nelson's character and understood his intent. Captain Graves and Captain Foley ignored Parker and kept their ships in the fight. However, the gallant Captain Ryu, who could not see Nelson's ship, clearly felt bound to obey Parker. As he turned his battered frigate away from the treacherous fort, he was cut in half by a Danish cannonball. His death was a tragic consequence of the conflicting orders and the confusion of battle. By early afternoon, the superior gunnery of the British began to tell. The Danish flagship, the Dannebrog, caught fire and drifted down the line, flames licking at her rigging. One by one, the Danish floating batteries were silenced, their hulls shattered, and their crews decimated. Yet the Danes refused to surrender. Fresh crews rowed out from the shore to replace the dead and dying, maintaining a sporadic fire even from wrecked vessels. This fanaticism posed a problem for Nelson, as he could not send boats to take possession of the prizes without them being fired upon. The carnage was horrific on both sides. The decks of the ships were slippery with blood, and the surgeons in the cockpits were overwhelmed with the wounded. Nelson, realizing that the battle had reached a stalemate where further fighting would only result in useless slaughter, decided to try a diplomatic gambit. He went to his cabin and wrote a letter addressed to the brothers of Englishmen, the Danes. In it, he stated that if the firing did not stop, he would be forced to set the captured floating batteries on fire with their brave crews still inside. This letter was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It appealed to the humanity of the Danes while containing a veiled threat of total annihilation. Nelson refused to seal the letter with a wafer, demanding a candle and wax to make a formal impression. He wanted to show that he was calm and not in a hurry, implying that he was in total control of the situation. The letter was sent under a flag of truce to the Crown Prince, who was watching the battle from the ramparts of the citadel. The arrival of the truce boat caused a pause in the firing. Crown Prince Frederick, concerned for the lives of his subjects and the safety of his capital, agreed to a ceasefire. He sent his adjutant General Lindholm to negotiate with Nelson. This pause was exactly what Nelson needed. His ships were battered, and many were in danger of running aground if they tried to withdraw under fire. The truce allowed him to move his crippled vessels away from the dangerous shoals and the guns of the treacherous fort. While the negotiations took place, the British ships began the arduous task of extricating themselves from the channel. The Elephant and several others grounded on the way out, proving just how precarious their position had been. If the battle had continued and the Treacherous fort had remained active, the British victory could easily have turned into a disaster. Nelson's bluff regarding the letter had saved his fleet as much as it had defeated the Danes. It was a victory of wits as much as weapons. The following day, Nelson went ashore to negotiate the terms of the armistice. He was greeted by a mix of curiosity and hostility by the Danish population. He met with the Crown Prince at the Amalienborg Palace. The conversation was tense but respectful. Nelson argued that the Danes should abandon the League of Armed Neutrality, while the prince defended his nation's honor and obligations. Nelson impressed the prince with his candor and his apparent desire for peace between the two nations. The negotiations dragged on for several days, with Nelson using all his charm and diplomatic skill. He frankly told the prince that he had destroyed the Danish defense line to protect them from the Russians and the French. Eventually, an armistice was signed. Denmark agreed to suspend its participation in the League of Armed Neutrality for 14 weeks. This was a crucial diplomatic victory for Britain, as it effectively broke the back of the coalition without requiring a permanent occupation or further bloodshed. While the ink was drying on the treaty, news arrived that the Tsar of Russia Paul I had been assassinated. His successor Alexander I was more favorable to Britain, and the League of Armed Neutrality collapsed entirely. The strategic objective of the expedition had been achieved. Admiral Parker, who had played such a passive role in the victory, was soon recalled to Britain, leaving Nelson in supreme command of the Baltic Fleet. The transition was welcomed by the sailors, who idolized Nelson and had little respect for Parker. The Battle of Copenhagen came at a high cost. The British suffered roughly 1,000 killed and wounded, while the Danish casualties were significantly higher, estimated at nearly 2,000. The city of Copenhagen had been spared from bombardment, but its navy was shattered. The encounter left a deep scar on Danish relations with Britain, but it also earned their grudging respect for Nelson's abilities. For the British, it was a reaffirmation of their naval dominance and a warning to any nation that sought to challenge their control of the seas. Nelson's conduct during the battle became the subject of much debate. His disobedience of Parker's order was technically a court-martial offense. However, in the Royal Navy, success was the ultimate justification. The Admiralty could not punish a man who had delivered such a resounding victory. The phrase "turning a blind eye" entered the English lexicon, a permanent reminder of the moment when Nelson chose to see only what he wanted to see. It symbolized the importance of initiative and moral courage in leadership. The tactical lessons of Copenhagen were studied by naval officers for generations. It demonstrated the effectiveness of overwhelming firepower at close range and the importance of knowing when to break the rules. It also highlighted the dangers of fighting against shore batteries and the difficulties of navigating in shallow waters. Nelson's plan, though risky, relied on the superior training and discipline of his crews, which proved to be the deciding factor against the brave but less experienced Danes. For Nelson personally, Copenhagen was a confirmation of his genius, but also a reminder of his mortality. He had felt the wind of cannonballs and seen his friends die around him. Yet he remained convinced of his destiny. His letters from this period reveal a man who felt he was doing God's work in defending his country. The victory added another laurel to his reputation, setting the stage for his final and greatest triumph at Trafalgar 4 years later. The ships of the British fleet, battered and scarred, eventually returned to England. They brought with them the stories of the battle, the smoke, the noise, and the blind eye. The public celebrated Nelson as a hero, while Parker quietly faded into retirement. The political landscape of Europe continued to shift, with Napoleon continuing his rise, but for a moment the northern flank of Britain was secure. The Baltic remained open to British trade, and the threat of a combined northern fleet had been extinguished. In the grand tapestry of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Copenhagen is often overshadowed by the Nile or Trafalgar. However, it was a battle of immense strategic importance. Had Nelson failed, the British economy might have been strangled, leading to a forced peace with France. The courage shown by the Danish defenders and the tactical brilliance of Nelson make it a unique engagement where the environment played as much of a role as the combatants. Today, the King's Channel is quiet, the sounds of battle long replaced by the gentle lapping of waves and the hum of modern commerce. But the memory of that cold April day remains. It stands as a testament to the brutal reality of naval warfare in the age of sail. It is a story of iron men in wooden ships, of orders given and ignored, and of a single eye that saw victory where others saw only defeat. The whisper of time carries the echoes of the broadsides, reminding us that history is often made by those who dare to risk everything.